right, and we're also gonna go live on YouTube as well. All right. Hello and welcome to PMP Live. I'm Alan Watke, an event coordinator with Politics and Prose. Thank you for joining us in this new format in the midst of these extraordinary times, from the pandemic, which forced us all inside of our homes, to the police brutality protests. Oh, what's going on? Sorry about that. And yeah, to the police brutality protests, and as part of the Black Lives Matter that is now compelling us to get back out of our houses. Throughout all of this, we strive to continue to bring you the authors you love and their new books to the Politics and Prose community. At any time during the event, you can click on the link that I'll add to the chat to purchase Whaling Captains of Color on Politics and Prose website. Today, you can ask the author a question by clicking on the Q&A link, which can be found near the bottom of your screen. And finally, we want to thank you for being here with us today. We're so thankful to our family of loyal customers, keeping our business and our spirits afloat. I'm so pleased to welcome to PMP Live, Skip Finley, celebrating his new book, Whaling Captains of Color. Skip is a former broadcasting executive who is responsible for over 40 US radio stations and experienced success in all areas of radio. He is the author of Historic Tales of Oak Bluffs, and for 5 years, Finley wrote the weekly Oak Bluffs Town Column and is a contributor to several publications in the areas of whaling and its history. He has written articles for the Vineyard Gazette, Martha's Vineyard Magazine, The Intelligencer, among many others. Joining Skip in conversation today will be John H. Kennedy, the author of A Course of Their Own, a history of African-American golfers. He's also currently working on a book about American war correspondents, and he is edited Whaling Captains of Color with Skip. So please join me in welcoming to PMP Live, Skip Finley and John H. Kennedy. Hey, fellas.
Thanks, Alan.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm really hoping wherever you are in participating, it's a rainy day. It's a beautiful day here on Martha's Vineyard. Almost a beach day, except I understand there's some big waves out there from the tropical storm that's just missed the island and headed up north. I have with me, one of my very dear friends, a person who I admire greatly, John Kennedy, for several reasons, not the least of which is his boss is also my boss, Jane Seagrave, the publisher of the Vineyard Gazette, who John is married to. When we met at a mutual friend's dinner party, John and I wound up sitting next to each other. And as part of the conversation, I said that, I decided I wanted to be a writer after my career in broadcasting. And John was very, very supportive. And in fact, he gave me a small pamphlet-sized book that I read about 9 times. And over and over and over, what the book said was writers write, get the point. Later that evening, in meeting his wife, who hired me to write the Town of Oak Bluffs column for the Vineyard Gazette, which was an extraordinary honor for a lot of reasons. We're here on Martha's Vineyard, where I grew up during the summer, and knew a lot about the place. And ultimately, that column, after 5 years, became another book, Historic Tales of Oak Bluffs. But in meeting John, one of the more important things, besides convincing me that writers write and that perhaps this is something I could do, he agreed to edit my book, which by the time I completed the first manuscript, it's funny to look back on now, but as I submitted the email of that manuscript to my editor at the time, my acquisition editor, Laura DeVoulis at the Naval Institute, and in the body copy, I said, by the way, how many words should this be? And she sent me an email back and said, well, we're hoping to be somewhere between maybe 70 or 80,000. Well, I sent her manuscript of, John, about 160,000 words with 1,400 footnotes. And she said, no, hell no. You're not writing the Bible. This is a book about, 50 Black guys who became whaling captains. So it was thanks to John, who was able to tactfully and tastefully remove everything that did not have to do with whaling and Black whaling captains and there was a lot of it. So, John knows how much I appreciate and love him and his work. But this book, there would be no such book, but after two of them, for decidedly different reasons. One gave me a job of, writing, and one convinced me that I could write. I think one of the things that John said at dinner was very, very poignant, was, well, what have you written? I said, well, a bunch of, I read loan documents and business plans and strategic plans. I've been doing it for, X number of years and, kind of tired of it. So I said, well, how'd that work out? Were you able to borrow any money? So I said, yeah, put together $500 million worth of deals. He said, well, you can write, which is an unusual way of convincing me, but it turned out to be true. Anyway, along the way, in working at the Vineyard Gazette, what prompted this book was the Charles W. Morgan, which some of you may not be familiar with, is the last wooden whale ship. That's a very big deal to folks in the whaling community, because after about 100 years or so, the entire boat was restored. One of its stops after it was put back in the water was Martha's Vineyard. It had, I think, 7 of its captains over its 40-some-year history as a whale ship were from Martha's Vineyard. So Martha's Vineyard magazine and its editor, Paul Schneider, that they're going to devote the entire issue of the May-June 2014, to whaling, and the Charles W. Morgan. Ironically, there was one known Black whaling captain here from Martha's Vineyard, and Paul asked if I'd like to write a story about him to include with the issue. So I did. In doing the research, it did not take long to occur to me, how in the hell did this Black guy get to be a whaling captain, in the late 1800s? Well, one thing led to another. I'm both gifted and cursed. I'm ADHD and OCD. So my short attention span, managed to focus on this guy and how he got to be a whaling captain. And before I knew it, I had bought and written 100 or so books on whaling, or another way of saying that is I bought all the books on whaling, made notes, put them on spreadsheets, and I found the rest of these guys and managed to weave that into a story of how this came to be true. To my surprise, he was first, not the only one, but he was not the first one. The first one, Paul Cuffey, was a captain back in the 1700s, in and around the years of the Revolutionary War. And the book proceeds, to talk about these guys, how they got there, and whaling itself.
That's my cue.
That's your cue.
Skip, I'm honored to be here. And I really value our friendship, and I also value our professional relationship here. And you have a lot to be proud of with this book. The one thing I'd say about Skip in the course of researching and writing this book is he had this insatiable curiosity about the subject, to the point where he would go anywhere at any time if there were data to be gathered to support this book. And there is a lot of data in this book, as you'll see, and I hope you all will check out the link that Alan put up on the chat part of this webinar. There are several appendices that include incredible data about all the captains of color that sailed, how many voyages they went on, how many whales they caught, the value of the whales that they caught, and on and on. It's extraordinary. And the tip of my non-existent hat here to Skip for pursuing this sort of information and data. In addition to which, it's not just about the data. There are incredible stories about amazing men in this book, and they're all men. I don't know, were there any female captains that you know of, Skip?
No captains. There were females involved with several ships, and there's a couple of stories. One of the captains was actually taught to navigate by another whale captain's wife, who was a navigator aboard a ship, Valentine Rosa.
And some of these captains took their families on these on these whaling trips, right?
Yes, Charles William T. Shorey took his family on it. Rosa took his, and a couple other ones. It wasn't something that was widely done, but occasionally.
Well, anyway, and I'm going to get to a question here in a moment. The other thing that this book has is not just the data, and the information, but Skip tells amazing stories about these people, and that's what really makes this book sing. It really, I think, for those of you who buy it, you'll really enjoy it. So,
well, I'd be remiss if I didn't also say, John was the perfect editor for this book, because the book he wrote, A Course of Their Own, about Black golfers, which is another subject I knew absolutely nothing about. In fact, I used to be a member of Lowe's Island Club, that down there in Virginia. And a mutual friend of ours, put together this lady named Rose Elder, who played with me at my course. And it was in the middle of that playing that I found out her husband was Lee Elder, who John had written about, which is amazing. Yeah. So it all dovetails so nicely, with men people had not heard of, who had not paid attention to, who managed to make a way of their own despite everything else.
It just goes to show you that history is not a static thing. And there's so much we do not know that needs to be dug up and written about. And I think that this book is a classic example of that. Skip, so what I wanted to ask you about is, this title is provocative, not just whaling captains of color. And I think a good number of people probably didn't know that there were captains of color who were whalers, but
including myself.
Well, including me.
Yeah.
But it also says this is America's first meritocracy. So can you describe that a little bit?
Yes, it's an amazing claim. But what it is well, first the title itself, Laura DeVos, my first editor, Glenn Griffith's name was one who actually got the book, finalized, produced, and published. But we're talking about about the title. I'm not even going to tell you the first name that I had, because it was awful. But there's two stories. First, the whaling captains of color. I wanted to be about Black whaling captains, but in those days, and it's become more true today, it was very difficult to define who was Black. So that was why I use, men of color, and we'll talk a little bit more, of that. But then the evocative nature was really the answer to the question of how did a Black man during the entire period of slavery get to be captain of anything, much less the whaling ship. And it was because it was a business that was so bad, it was so awful, that no one wanted to go. Over the course of its 280-year history or so, whaling was participated in by about 175,000 people. As it turned out, somewhere between 20 and 40% of those people, were people of color, men of color. And despite all of us who did not read Moby Dick when we were told to, there's a lot more romance in the book Moby Dick by Herman Melville than there was on the deck of a whale ship. There was nothing fun, there was nothing enjoyable, there was nothing interesting. And the truth is, probably as many as 90% of all the people who ever went whaling only did it once and wanted to get off that boat as fast as they could. The stories abound.
Stop there, Skip. Why would they only go once? Describe that.
You're in a very difficult physical business, in the worst of possible conditions, on a boat averaging maybe 100 feet long with 20 to 30 other people, and you're there on that boat for somewhere between 2 to 4 years, averaging 3 years on a whale ship. So you can start there, and then it goes downhill. The whaling itself, what our familiarity with whaling today, is seeing the Vineyard Vines logo and the pink version of the sperm whale. Today, in fact, there's more money made by whale watching than killing them. But back when they were killing whales, in huge numbers and in droves, millions of the largest creatures that have ever been on the planet Earth. The way that they did it was just awful. A man in the top of the mast would see a whale. He would say, "Thar blows, not there she blows." There's, that's been, taken out of context, far too often. And that very first time that a young man, 18, 17, 16, 19 years old, heard that, as excited as he can be, and he looks around to find that whale. Well, the boat points itself in that direction. They drop the 3 or 4 whale ships. 6 men get into each one. They row towards that whale. When they get close enough, they stick a harpoon into it. So you're in a 30-foot wooden boat attacking, a 30-ton, 40-ton creature who's very unhappy about that, and invariably would take off, creating the romantic notion of the Nantucket sleigh ride. And that we kind of disassociate, at that point. But in fact, once that whale slows down, they get closer and closer and closer, and they attack it and they stab it as much as they can to kill it, and wait for it to roll over. When it rolls over, regurgitates. Well, a sperm whale, for example, eats squid. Many people who fish have a pretty good idea what that smells like. Imagine what one that's been eaten already smells like. And not by the bucket or the gallon, but by the truckload. So you're amidst this awful mess filled with blood in sometimes stormy seas. And by now you may be 3 or 4 miles away from the boat. Well, the boat's not catching you. Once the whale dies, you now have to tow it and row it back, to the big ship so it can be processed. That processing, is they set a platform out from the side of the whale ship, which would remind you of a platform, used to wash windows in tall buildings. So imagine that, just inches above the water. They chain the whale up to it. They roll it around. While they're rolling the whale, they cut it into big pieces. They winch the big pieces up to the boat and cut them into smaller pieces. Once they cut them into what's called the Bible sheets, the thinest ones, they throw them into these iron cauldrons built atop a brick platform aboard the whale ship. They put them in there and they melt it down until it becomes viscous enough to become oil. Then they pour it into barrels and they repeat the process. This is something that may take 24 hours. So you can kind of guess at what that might smell like. It's almost unimaginable, the physical effort and labor, of doing that right around the clock until there's nothing but the carcass left. At that point, they let the carcass float away and they let the sharks eat it because, oh yeah, if you fall off, you're going to be eaten yourself. And by the way, and that's not the worst part of a whale ship or a whale trip either. But hey, what people said was, how does that guy get to become captain? Well, there have been recorded 15,913 whale trips aboard 2,700 ships, managed by 2,500 captains, each of which had a crew somewhere between 13 and 36 folks, on it. Of those 2,700, something happened to 950 of those guys. They died. It was rare, but they could have been eaten by a whale. They could have drowned. They could have committed suicide. But when you're 1,200 miles out to sea on a whale trip and something happens to the captain, somebody's got to take their place. And more often than not, the people with the most experience were men of color because they didn't have the options back on land that everybody else had. They had to do it over and over and over and over again. By your third, by your fourth, by your fifth trip, you kind of figured out, how to find a whale, kill a whale, process the whale, and get it home. Well, that's how these men of color became captains, hence the nature of my use of the word meritocracy. Is we don't care who you are, we don't care what you look like. If you can get us home and kill more whales, you're the boss, more power to you.
Well, Skip, let me just read one little passage from your book that describes what a captain needs to be. Captain was a physician, a surgeon, a lawyer, a diplomat, a financial agent, an entrepreneur, a taskmaster, a judge, a peacemaker, a sailor, a whaleman, and a navigator. I mean, that's a collection of skills.
And the title we use, captain, the specific one is they use the word master. Okay, and in this case, more so than any business that I've come across, so far, these guys were omnipotent. They could do whatever they want. They had to maintain order for years and years and years at a time of the same folks. There was no fighting on the whale trip. There was no saying no. Up until it took until 1850 before the U.S. government outlawed flogging. Okay, so more than half the time that whaling was a business, your captain could flog you. He had to exert discipline. When he said jump the whale boat, row after that creature, go out there and kill it and bring it back. There was no qualificating, pontificating. You had to just go and do it. Hence the expression master.
Just a side note here. We welcome questions from you all, and we'll get to those eventually. But Skip and I wanted to cover just a little bit of ground, just to give you a little bit more context about the subject and also the book. So Skip,
Yeah.
Here there's a particular figure who I guess you could call a pioneer, and he's the only Black whaler who has his own small exhibit in the Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., and that's Paul Cuffey. Could you talk a little bit about his significance?
Yeah, well, actually, Paul Cuffey has an exhibit in the New Bedford Whaling Museum, which is 2 rooms that are apparently scale models of his home. So you see the very tiny room with the walls covered in soot, and that's part of whaling, because why do people go whaling? Initially, after the Native Americans would use the critters for food, we went looking for whales because of the oil, and the oil was used to light our homes. The difference was the rich man's oil at that time was spermaceti, what comes from the head of a sperm whale. When it burned, it didn't leave that smoke, like the candles made from tallow used to leave. So most American homes, when we talk about New England, were dirty little hovels. That was your life. I mean, imagine during the winter when you need that oil to light and heat your house. That's why oil was worth so much money. In fact, the New England area, those Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, New Bedford, and to an extent Sag Harbor and Long Island, were the Middle East in the most literal sense, but the oil was used differently. And that was the first use of oil. The second, use of it was, for our street lights, and then the other parts of the whale came into play. The baleen, which is a keratin-like substance which grows from the top of certain whales, which allows them to separate the seawater from the krill, the organisms that they eat. Well, it was found, after years and years, they could cut these things down. They call it whale bone, and they may be 12 to 20 feet long. But when they were heated, they would stay in the same shape. So this product was used in umbrellas and in all sorts of things, shoe horns, and particularly in women's corsets, the whale bone was used to keep that shape. Ironically enough, at the end of whaling, the last blow to it was when the French decided that corsets, women wanting those 18-inch waists was no longer in style. And the whales were saved because that was the only thing they had. Now, two discoveries over the years. One, the oil itself. Shale oil was discovered in Pennsylvania in 1857. So it was a lot safer and a lot easier digging oil from the ground. So that replaced the oil that we were using for heat and light, and ultimately as a lubrication, because it was at the end of its industry, the whale oil that was used to lubricate the Industrial Revolution in America. So yes, the cotton gin and the railroads, all those things use real whale oil, okay, to grease, the way of the future. The baleen was replaced by what we know today as plastic, okay, or spring steel, which are, again, easier to manufacture, easier to produce, particularly compared with going out into the ocean, hunting whales, killing it and using it very inefficiently in that manner.
So could we circle back to Paul Cuffey?
I'm sorry.
That's okay. No.
Yeah.
Okay.
Um,
Why was he significant?
he was significant because he had the God-given talent to navigate. Okay, when he was born on Cuttyhunk Island, which is near Martha's Vineyard. His folks, had a large family. They lived on Martha's Vineyard. They moved over to Westport and Dartmouth, just outside of New Bedford. And he was just a fan of the sea. He wound up building his own boats and became a captain. He hired out on a whale ship at a young age, I think about 14 years old. Along the way, Paul Cuffey was captured by the British in the Revolutionary War, released. He was captured by pirates. They took all the stuff, and released him. But Paul Cuffey built a business out of shipping, which was based upon whaling. He and his partner, Michael Wainer, did that. Well, we're talking the late 1700s, early 1800s, when Paul Cuffey owned and was captain of his own ship. Paul Cuffey for years was the wealthiest Black person in America, thanks, to his ability to do that. He fought for justice. He fought for equal rights. He made a decision at one point that, if we Black people, couldn't have freedom in America, why not take Black people to Sierra Leone over in Africa and establish, a community there. That didn't go as well, as planned. A lot of other people, James Fortin, another very wealthy Black man and a contemporary of Paul Cuffey, said, no, we're here. We should enjoy the same rights as everyone else. We're not the ones that should have to leave. But anyway, because Paul was the first and associated himself with so many other people, I think there were 11 other men who became captains thanks to Paul Cuffey.
Wow. That's amazing.
That small exhibit he has, Paul Cuffey is the only whaling captain with his own exhibit. That means that's out of all 2,700 captains. So that's a pretty big deal.
Yeah.
They're also now at the New Bedford Whaling Museum as a park, dedicated named after Paul Cuffey and his partner and the Wainer family.
Now, is it true that his descendants still get together every year or two?
I don't know the frequency, but yes, it is. Which is amazing in itself. One thing, these 52 guys who we know were Black, whaling captains of color, they generated about $75 million in products that they returned from trips with, here in America. I recognize $75 million is not a lot of money, per se, and that's in today's dollars. But in those days, for that to occur, is truly amazing. Paul Cuffey began that. Now, this is a time when, if you think about it, most Black people couldn't read and write, and it was against the law to teach them.
Incredible.
Just to put it in context, the accomplishment that this man made.
In this book, Skip, obviously it's devoted primarily to captains, but you also talk about a couple of men who were quite accomplished in their own right. One was a ship designer, and the other was an inventor. I wondered if you could talk about those two.
And the third, yeah, in the order, John Mashow, amazingly enough, designed and built over 100 ships. 14 of these ships were used by other men of color, other captains of color. which is astounding. This is in the 1800s. It was said that his were the best designed ships and whale ships ever. Another who was a contemporary was Lewis Temple, who invented a device called Temple's toggle. As simple as that sounds, when you stick that harpoon into the whale, it wasn't until the 1840s when Lewis Temple attached this little toggle to it so that when you stuck it in the whale, it would stay there. All right. It is said that is the only single invention in the entire business of whaling,
Jeez.
in 1840.
Period. Wow.
Yeah. And he died broke.
Of course.
Yeah. A whale trip can use, 50, 60, 70 harpoons. So, this is just astounding. Let me just talk about the business of whaling, introduce another character, Richard Johnson, who married into the Cuffey family. Himself, wasn't a captain, but he was aboard the ship. He was the one that decided, how to outfit the ship. He was a ship owner, and he owned ships built by Mashow. He owned ships that were captained by other black captains, as well as being married into the Cuffey family.
Amazing.
Which is just astounding. Who knew? I was flabbergasted, to find these things and just come across these men's names.
Who else in your mind, maybe one or two other captains, deserves his own exhibit as somebody we should recognize and remember?
We should know the name William Shorey. He was from Provincetown. He sailed out of San Francisco. He's the number 1 or number 2 whale catcher, for a number of years. He was I forget exactly. It's in the book, how many whales and how many times. But he took 20 some whaling trips as captain, not just as a crewman, but as captain. I think he's very important. I think there's one, Henry Gonzalez, who was a dead up scoundrel. He actually stole a whale ship, that he was using to take people on a visit up in Canada. But I thought that was kind of unique. Good ones, having bad ones. There's so many there. It's hard finding a lot of information about a few of these guys.
Yeah.
Okay. But the ones who stand out, Valentine Rosa, was just truly amazing. He wound up later on, not on a whale ship, but he died at sea. There was Samuel Harris from Nantucket, who took one whale ship, but the one whale ship was the biggest one of all the black captains. And there's several touchstones, historical touchstones, that he was. One was the ship that he captained, the Phoebe, was the first. It was one of the last ships from Nantucket, but it was one of the first that Nantucket, had to invent a system to get their large ships across their very shallow harbor, which, by the way, is why New Bedford replaced Nantucket, as a whaling capital of the world. So there are many. They each played a role. They each have they play a part in the story. There's a couple who were killed by whales, which is something that didn't happen, as often as people believe. There were several involved in mutinies, one on one side or the other, which is something else that didn't happen as many times as people would believe.
But happened enough. I think you
mutinies were worldwide news.
Yeah.
When that happened, I
Yeah.
believe there were 47 out of these 15,000 trips.
Wow.
And I probably should mention, we're talking about the business of whaling. Those 15,000 trips, each of those was a completely different business enterprise. There was a wonderful article written, I should remember the guy's name, Harvard case study just last summer. And whaling was essentially the model for today's hedge fund and our private equity firm. Okay, each enterprise, each trip had different owners who invested into it. Somewhere between this is a $50,000 to $60,000 our money investment, buy the ship, outfit the ship, get the crew, hire them, send them out to bring whales back. When they come back, with the cash, with the hulls full, hopefully, they deduct from that the money they spent already, so they come out whole, and then they distribute proportionally based upon your performance, whatever the profits were. They, of course, took the largest piece, but if you were a captain, you could get somewhere between 1/10 to 1/15 of the profits of that trip. If you were a green hand and, brand new, the young kid, you might only get 1/200. So fairly often, half the crew would come back and actually owe money instead of having, participated in the profits.
Skip, I just wanted to ask one other question, then we'll go to some of the questions that folks watching this have. And that is, for me, it was so interesting to read that, our Native Americans had been whaling for centuries and centuries and centuries, and essentially taught white Europeans how to whale. I wonder if you could talk about that just a little bit.
Yes, several ways. It's a toss-up depending on who you believe. Did drift whaling start off the shores of Connecticut? Did it start on Long Island, at Sag Harbor? But a whale would die, the currents would bring it up to the land. The Native American population would use it for products. Okay, they would eat some of it as food. They would make things out of the bone, or the baleen, if that's the type of whale it was. After a while, they figured, why wait for the whale to roll up? Let's ride our canoes out there and shoot it with arrows and stick it until it dies and bring it back. That was how whaling was started. Again, there could be a very good argument. Did that type of whaling, meaning going out to sea, kill the whale, did that start in Martha's Vineyard or Nantucket? Many people would say Nantucket. The whaling community, no one really knows. Nantucket gets the credit, but Martha's Vineyard could make a case for it as well. Over the years, though, a funny thing happened. First, by the early 1700s, these amazing warriors, the people who invented harpooning a whale, died from the diseases the Europeans brought with them. Not just the vicious ones like smallpox, but the measles, the mumps, and those type things. Now whether it's by accident or design, no one knows. I kind of lean and look towards Nantucket and say, no, it probably wasn't, by design, because they needed these guys to pursue this industry. They were the ones who, after starting it, created the opportunity for the Black people, the Black men, to come and pursue this. And then here here's time we get into the title, Men of Color. I was able to identify these folks from documents called the Seamen's Protection Papers, which function kind of, sort of, like early passports to keep our seamen from being impressed by the British in the several times we had sea battles with them, which is from 1776, of course, all the way through 1812. Someone, a customs officer, a captain of the ship, one of the owners, would make a list of who's on the ship, and you would be described not just by your name, but by your characteristics, your physical characteristics. Were you black, brown, yellow, copper? Were you white? Were you black? And these papers were recorded over the years. In the 1930s, I think the Workers' Progress Administration was putting people to work, after the Great Depression. And one of the tasks was to take that handwritten information, and record it on index cards. So in the New Bedford Free Public Library, there's 131 card catalog, 131 drawers with all this information, which over the years, people like Judith Lund, would take the compendiums of information about whaling and compare that to these things, and made what we now, generally call the crew list, which is available, at the New Bedford Whaling Museum and the New Bedford Free Public Library. And that was what I used to identify some of these guys, find who they were by their characteristics. I lost my train of thought because that was kind, that was kind of exciting, to
Well,
me.
yeah, we were talking about Native Americans and how they fall under, of course,
Okay.
color. And,
Then just past that, let's say late 1700s, a rather insidious course, took place, which was Black people were told, if you marry and have children with Native Americans, your children can never be slaves. Okay, first of all, that wasn't true. Second, it was illegal to teach Black people, how to read, so they had no basis for knowing whether this was true or not. In fact, when that happened, now that you are half Black and half Native American, you're no longer entitled to tribal land, so the white man could take that from you as well. Okay, Tam, did someone really come up with this as a plan? Yes, they did. Yes, they did. It's documented. So you have the Native American people dying from disease that Europeans brought with them. Now they're being bred out of existence on purpose. Okay, so they're losing. So how do you define who's Black or who's Native American? So in the book, what I do is I use the expression self-identify. And there's several examples of that. Paul Cuffey's mom, his dad was a freed slave. His mom was Native American. Same with the Weiner family. Same for many of these people. Paul Cuffey, the Weiner, several of these guys, they identified as Black. Well, then you have the Lee family, whose dad was the patriarch. I'll say was Black, but Native Americans were they were Shinnecox. Okay, they identified as Native Americans. So I wasn't in a position to characterize who they were. A third were the Cape Verdeans. Mm-hmm. Or as my good friend Hal Vicente, said to me one time when we were younger, he says, we're the Africans who came to America on purpose, which I actually use in the book because it's so true. Well, the fact is, Cabo de Verde, which is now what their country is called, is only 350 miles off the coast of Western Africa. So yes, they're Africans, but they're not African Americans, if you follow. And then there are just so many levels of characterization. For example, in America, you had people who were brought here from Africa as slaves. Then over the years, you had people who were freed. Okay, well, they weren't Americans until 1865. Yeah. Okay, so African American is a misnomer. All right, in some cases, African was a misnomer because perhaps you had been a freed slave. Maybe you married someone outside of your race. Well, what are you now? Compound that further was, how do you treat the West Indians? Mm-hmm. Okay, what are they? They're not slaves. So you could call them Black generally. So the definition wound up being one that was characterized by, the majority population or the white man decide, you're Black. Yeah. Now back around to the Cape Verdeans, grew up a lot of Cape Verdeans here. They didn't recognize themselves.
Real quick, because we've got a bunch of questions. I want to get to them. So
all right,
go ahead, but wrap up with the Cape Verdeans because that's an important chapter.
Okay, it is. The Cape Verdeans were the ones who had to leave their country because of drought. They had no water. They had to come over here. So when the business was ending, they bought these whale ships for pennies on a dollar, and they renamed them. They retyped them as packet ships. So they would take products and goods over to Cabo de Verde and bring the people back here, generally to New Bedford and Providence.
Great. All right. So let's get as many of these as we can. So Ed asks, how many whales would be killed in a normal trip? Is there any way of knowing that?
There's not. You actually have to do that trip by trip. It's a question I'd ask myself. It was not untoward that you might catch one whale a month. So imagine how boring the trip was the rest of the time. Okay, there were times when you'd be there for 3 or 4 years and not find any whales. Mm-hmm. That happened with a couple of our captains. So you can't do it. But then there are other times, when, in the early days when ships would come back with, with 2,000 barrels, of oil, which is quite a few whales killed.
Yeah. Wow.
I do explain the math, how I made these determinations. But whale, a gallon as it was measured of whale oil sold from anywhere from 12 cents to $2.50 to $2.60 a gallon. I use 40 gallons per barrel, to do the sum of this math. And the way that they described, whales was, oh, that's a 90-barrel whale, meaning that was the product of that whale after it was killed.
Okay, Reggie asks of Washington, D.C. asks this question. You've sort of answered a little bit, but maybe there's more to add, that these trips out to sea had to cost a lot of money and resources back then. How did they afford it? And it sounded like there were investors.
Good question. I know that Reggie, that must be Reggie Sanders, is a hell of a basketball player and now a bike rider, as we age gracefully. The rule is $50,000 to $60,000, okay, to launch a whale trip. It could be substantially less. It could be probably not too much more than that. I'm using today's dollars because that's, easily comprehensible. There's so many different ways, to approach that, but the money came from the original whalers, who were the Quakers or the Friends. And this was a business that they adopted, they excelled at, and they built the business from Nantucket all the way over to, to New Bedford. What's probably more important than that was it was the Quakers who put Black people on the road to freedom. And they did this when, slavery was outlawed because of a whaling incident, by the way, in 1773. Slavery was outlawed in the state of Massachusetts in 1783. It took another 100 years for that to be true, for the rest of the population.
Yeah. Skip, Lynn asks, is there any information suggesting that these captains created generational wealth for people of color? If they reinvested into their communities, do you have examples of those legacies in the Vineyard, Nantucket, New Bedford, Sag Harbor?
I wish I could tell you that. The answer is no. Again, whaling was something, that was roughly the mid 1650s till almost specifically 1928. The overwhelming majority of that time, Black people were enslaved. Okay, for all of the period of whaling, there was nowhere for you to invest your money when you came back. And I can show you, there's guys came back, make $50,000 from a whaling trip in today's money. Where do you put it? A, B, the Boston family, I think made it through 2 generations. The Cuffeys made it through probably 2.5 generations. After that, the money became, used, for subsistence.
Yeah, they were the exceptions, really.
They were the exceptions. You could probably identify as many as a half dozen homes that were owned by Black whaling captains. I know one here on Martha's Vineyard, the William A. Martin House.
William Martin's, yeah.
Yeah, but that, that's, sign of the times.
Yeah. Skip, Robin asks, can you please comment on the lives of some of these captains of color on land? Did they also experience respect and stature when not whaling?
No. in answer, I use an expression that Jeffrey Bolster, wrote in his book Blackjacks, and it is, a Black man could slap or flog a white man aboard ship who he couldn't legally look in the eye on land.
Right.
And this, a whaling master was God.
Yeah.
Aboard a ship.
On the sea, but on land.
Just another brother.
MC says, great book. Can you please compare to Japanese whaling?
No. Japanese whaling, which unfortunately continues today, is slaughter. There's no sport, there's no usefulness. They don't use the entire whale. They've got huge whale, and not just the Japanese, but the Norwegians as well, and sometimes the Russians. There's absolutely no justification for whaling today. Okay, you know, as a cultural exercise, I believe the Inuits in in Northwest, the Northwest United States, they're allowed to capture one whale a year, but that's part of their cultural heritage.
Yeah, right.
You don't need to eat whales. You don't need whale oil. You don't need whale bone. You don't need to be killing a whale.
So what do the Japanese use it for?
Aphrodisiacs. What can I tell you?
Yeah. Yeah.
There's zero. There's no justification for killing an animal. Who, by the way, in Philip Hoare's book, The Whale, someone found the whale with a harpoon in it that they carbon dated to find that whale was over 200 years old. The fact is, there may be whales swimming around in the ocean today who've been doing that since before there was an America in 1776.
Wow.
A whale is an animal, whose heart beats only 8 times a minute. Compare that with a hummingbird's. Okay, you can see why a little tiny hummingbird, lives for that long, and whales can live for hundreds of years. There's no justification for killing an animal that is believed has a religion, that knows how to use tools, who's got a higher intelligence than most animals, on this earth. There's absolutely no justification for killing whales. I've seen a whale breaching. I was 15 or so miles off the fishing trip off the coast of Acapulco. I will never forget what that looked like. It was amazing.
Mm-hmm. Skip, this is more of a statement than a question from Lisa, who says she learned about African-American whalers from reading the excellent young adult nonfiction book, Black Hands, White Sails.
White Sails, yeah, by the McKissicks.
Yes, yes.
Floyd and Mary McKissick, yeah. Great book, very useful resource.
Yeah.
And they covered, mine was more focused on captains because I was astounded that there was such a thing, as a Black or a man of color who was also captain of a whale ship.
Mm, mm. And one from Lynn again. You clearly did a lot of research, and there's a rich history of the Black mariner, yet not much written. Do you attribute these revelations to the lack of written history or suppressed history?
That's that's a tough one. Now we know a little about Reconstruction, and how the North won the war and the South won the argument. So I'm not that smart, to be able to say that, but I doubt it. But here's the deal. Here's a personal example. I saw the movie with Hidden Figures with my wife. Ladies, at in the space race, and it was astounding. And I will never forget. When John Glenn says in the movie, "All right, if that lady doesn't do the math, I'm not getting on the ship."
Yeah, yeah.
And, that was great. We were halfway home, and I'm like, that happened while I was alive. That's not ancient history. Okay, I was in high school or college or something like that. All right, why do I just find this out now? Okay, but there's so much about our history, that has been bothered. Listen, I don't want to get angry about it, but they brought 300, almost 400,000 of us over here from Africa and bred us into 3.9 million people that they could free. Okay, from 1619 until 1920, whatever the fallacy of Reconstruction ended. So man is a beast. Okay, and this has happened, but our stories haven't been written. Yeah,
absolutely. Lots out there to write about and discover. I had the same reaction to Hidden Figures. Why did we not know this?
That
Why
was
did you not know this?
astounding. And how much more do we not know?
Right.
We all know the the Black History Month stuff. Who invented the traffic light? Who perform the first heart operation? But that's just scratching the surface.
One more. I've got a couple of just quick whaling questions. Where were the bulk of these whaling ships built? That comes from Roger.
Good question. Good question. Not on Nantucket, which had no trees. A lot of them were built in in New Bedford and around New Bedford, which was surrounded by forest. Quite a few were built in Maine, Bath, Maine specifically.
Interesting.
Mhm.
And
Good question. Good question.
one more. How much oil came from an average size whale, and how long would it last in home lamps?
I don't know how long it would last in home lamps. That's something I'm probably going to go and spend a whole lot of time researching. That's a good question too. But I'm gonna kind of ballpark this and say 30 to 40 barrel whale was perhaps average. Now these guys they weren't that discriminative. They would kill a dwarf whale, which is about 300 and some pounds. Okay, and if they could catch it, they would kill a blue whale, which is about 300,000 pounds. And to put that in perspective, a dwarf whale is the size of a blocking guy in the NFL. And a 300,000 pound blue whale is the size of the entire NFL. And sometimes, whalers, they would kill elephants and melt them down. They would kill seals and melt them down. They would kill porpoises. They would kill pilot whales. They weren't that discriminate. But the top of the food chain was the spermaceti.
So Skip, one more question I think we have time for, and that's, I'm going to take it. What advice do you give to new writers, people that want to write, people who have a passion for a particular subject and want to pursue it and write something about it?
I think Nike already said it. Just do it. If you're going to be a writer, you're going to have to write. Writing is something I think it probably can be taught. I wasn't. It came easily to me. I was in the radio station business for the DC folks. I used to own WKYS down there. You might have heard it or heard of it. I didn't solve crimes, cure disease, or end wars. But I had the gift of gab, if you will. And I think it's something I was blessed with. If you want to write, you probably have the gift, but you have to do it.
Okay, I'm going to squeeze one more in if I can, and that's from Lisa, who asked, do you know if the African-American whaling captains were part of the Underground Railroad?
Yes, most definitively. Probably the best example is the one everyone knows, Frederick Douglass. He was able to escape slavery in Maryland by using those seaman protection papers I mentioned earlier to get on that Underground Railroad and find himself and his wife in the city of New Bedford, where after a while he became a caulker of whale ships. He also found himself on Nantucket, which is where he made his first speech, as the great orator. On Nantucket, there was in 1850, slavery, what was it? I'm forgetting it. It was basically people could take you back into slavery or put you in slavery, anytime they wanted. That happened on Nantucket. Except the folks in Nantucket said, no, hell no, you got to go get out of here. The Fugitive Slave Acts is what I'm thinking about.
Yeah. Last
but
comment.
specific to whaling, there were probably handful or better of whaling captains of color who, thanks to years and years and years of miscegenation, whatever you want to call it, don't look black. Black wasn't a good thing to be in the 1800s. Not that it's wonderful for everyone today.
And your friend Reggie has one more comment, and he thinks this would be a great movie. So are you writing
Right.
are you writing a screenplay?
I'm you know, like, look, it's the ADHD and the OCD. As a matter of fact, I'm calling it a treatment, not a movie, about a guy named Jubal, and he's a slave. He has to run away and he becomes a whaling captain. What's a little bit different is I'm going to put him on a lot of real whale ships, one of which is the Essex. Nathaniel Philbrick's great book. Yeah, let me on the whale ship Essex, you know, bottom line, that's the model of Moby Dick. Okay, the boat is sunk by a sperm whale. There were 7 black guys on board that ship. 4 were eaten and cannibalized. 2 went missing. 1 died, and 1 deserted. His name was Henry DeWitt. So I'm going to make this guy Jubal into a Henry DeWitt and put him on he'll be the guy who gets off the boat. But if anybody listening, you know, watching, you know, who can green light something, holler. My website is skipfinley.com. You know, reach out and let's get it on. I have been, you know, talking about a documentary, which I'd like to restrict to the first guys, the Cuffey and his family, that dynasty. I've been working with Stan Nelson, you know, fellow I grew up with, who happens to be an Emmy Award-winning, you know, filmmaker, you know, for a number of years.
Great filmmaker. Yeah. His latest.
Yeah, you know, I know you know Stan. Yeah.
Skip, it looks like our hour is past.
Went pretty quickly.
This has been great fun. And there's Alan.
There's Alan. Hey.
Yeah, thank you. That was just fascinating. And I'm really hoping to see Jubal on that on the big screen.
Well, the little screen, there's more money on the little screen.
Yeah, true. You know, make a series out of it. That's
and speaking of money, you know, listen, please, everyone, go out and buy a dozen books a piece. You don't have to read it. There's not going to be a test, but you can buy a dozen.
yeah. And seriously, the link is in the chat. So, you know, click on that link, buy a book or 2, give them to friends. It's your patronage that's keeping this bookstore out here and like making events like
Save independent bookstore.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
so
Let's
you know,
keep
purchase Whaling Captains of Color. Fascinating story. Absolutely. Thank you both so much for being here.
You.
Also, yeah, definitely. I also want to say, can follow us on our Eventbrite channel to see what events we have coming up. We have a ton of events coming up, so go ahead and check that out. Skip and John, thank you both so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Politics and Pros. We love you, man.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And y'all, thank you for being here. Stay safe and stay well read. See you next time.